Did you know that water management could limit directly at least 10% of greenhouse gases? I didn't know that, and I didn't know that it could do that with emissions, which is really fascinating. This means that how we manage the water is one of the big make or breaks for net zero and a just energy transition. A resilient, low-emission future depends on inclusive, climate-resilient plans that take into account water's crucial role, but it's also an opportunity for integrated solutions within adaptation and mitigation programming. In this session, we're going to invite some very interesting guests and experts to talk about solutions, real-life solutions, so that cities, countries, and companies can get water right for climate action. But first, let's watch another video about how countries can self-assess and enhance water resilience in their national climate plans.
Water is at the heart of climate action. In response to the climate emergency we're facing, countries around the world are developing national climate plans. These include nationally determined contributions and national adaptation plans, which include targets for reducing greenhouse gas emissions and actions for reducing vulnerability to the impacts of climate change. Water is needed for most, if not all, climate mitigation and adaptation actions. For climate plans to be successful, we as citizens, companies and governments need to consider key trade-offs between water uses and sectors. Imagine a country is developing a climate plan. The Ministry of Energy wants to use carbon capture and storage, CCS, to capture carbon dioxide, CO2, released from industry before it enters the atmosphere, a technology that requires a lot of water. Meanwhile, the Ministry of Agriculture has a goal of improving food security by expanding crop production. Increasing access to water and sanitation services is a priority for the Ministry of Public Works. Meeting each of these important goals is dependent on water. At the same time, climate change is impacting the global water cycle. Water resources are becoming more variable and less predictable. We can't count on historic patterns of water availability when planning for the future. How and where water is addressed in climate plans and how water is managed when these plans are implemented can mean the difference between projects succeeding or failing. Water resilience is a new approach for climate planning. It means taking into account the water requirements across sectors for agriculture, industry, energy, transport, the environment and public water services, and ensuring that plans are robust to cope with climate impacts we expect to happen in the future, and flexible enough to adapt to impacts that are harder to see and predict. The Water Tracker for National Climate Planning is a tool that's helping countries to self-assess and build water resilience in their national climate plans. A Water Tracker assessment helps reveal the hidden water needs of a country's climate plans, so that countries can decide how to best allocate water and what to do if there's not enough to go around. Decisions about trade-offs are made with stakeholders from multiple sectors at the table, and climate plans can be turned into achievable and impactful projects to ensure a future that is climate resilient for people, ecosystems, and economies.
So great. We have two first guests with us on this topic. Let me introduce John Matthews. He's Executive Director of the Alliance for Global Water Adaptation that I read since 2010. Has been working to bring new ideas to climate resilience through better water management. And we've also got Kate Hughes. She's the CEO of Resilient Water Accelerator, which again I read online, is looking to finance 50 million people to build resilience to climate change through the lens of water. I hope we've got that right. Good. John, let's turn to you first. Water is a resilience and a mitigation multiplier. For those viewers that don't know, mitigation is basically reducing emissions. What does this actually mean? Why is it a multiplier?
It's a great question, Nick. Most of our efforts to really slow down, to control climate change, they're about how we relate to the carbon cycle. Mm-hmm. And if you look at the 2015 Paris Agreement, that has really made climate mitigation a global priority, it turns out, in retrospect, that it was missing one word. It was missing water. And that's because water is really the vehicle that we need to actually make sure that a lot of our climate change actions are coherent, that they're effective. A quick example of that is if we think about most forms of energy production, they actually involve water consumption, water management, water choices. As was mentioned in the video, agriculture is essentially about water itself. But also issues like public health, thinking about most ecosystems, about forest management. The whole food cycle is really water intensive. And climate change is making us make different choices. And so what we're trying to do in Agua is through a series of programs to be able to make sure that we call out the role of water in that space, that it's not just water is the source of floods and droughts, it's not just a source of danger, it's actually the most effective, most important way of generating climate solutions.
Wasn't it an English poet that said, many have lived without love, but none without water? So I think that was the same. It was the one who was in Four Weddings and a Funeral. There's that poem at the end. It's the same poet. I can't remember. Anyway, Kate, let me come to you. We don't need to talk poetry right now. We can talk it later. But why is water's role in mitigation being overlooked? And I must say I was interested in the numbers, 10%, right? Exactly. Why is it being overlooked?
So I've been baffled by this since I kind of stepped into the world of water. My background is much more on the mitigation side, and no one ever mentioned water when I was working on mitigation and looking at energy and those kinds of things. And that figure of 10% of global emissions coming from water and water use and water management is shocking. And net zero is powerful precisely because it means that every single sector, every single actor has got to play their part, and everything has got to come down to zero, which means water is a non-negotiable in terms of thinking about mitigation and net zero, and yet, as you say, it's often overlooked. And I think there's sort of two elements to this. One is the direct involvement of water in creating emissions, and the other one is also the role of water in that wider transition that John just touched on as well. So we know that 4% of global electricity demand comes from just water and wastewater use. And that's set to double by 2040. And 10% of global methane comes from wastewater and poor wastewater management and sanitation and wetlands. That's a huge number, and there's a huge focus on methane now as well. But again, I don't think water is really recognised in all of that. And this is in a world where 4 billion people are living with severe water scarcity for at least a month a year. So while we think about the SDGs, and we think about SDG 7, which is the energy, but we also think about SDG 6, which is water, how do we get water security to those 4 billion people while not compromising 1.5 degrees? And then in that transition story, water sits behind industrial processes and use. You need something like 100,000 litres of water to make 1 tonne of lithium. So the transition to electric vehicles isn't going to happen if we're not thinking about water. Cooling for power stations, all of this, fundamental on water, and yet it is not considered. And I think there's 3 reasons for that. One is that it is subsumed within other categories. It isn't called out in its own right, so it becomes a second or third order priority after energy or after aviation and shipping, after industrial processes. The second one, which John also touched on, is that it's therefore not part of plans. It's not part of that integrated systems thinking. When people are designing cities, they're often not thinking about where does the water coming from.
We don't see the water.
Exactly. It's hidden in pipes underground, and it's
or
not
in processes in our clothes and our energy.
Exactly. So it's ignored there. And I think the third really important part, which we're particularly looking at through the Resilient Water Accelerator, is water isn't valued. It's seen very much as a kind of a free good. It's there, it's everywhere, it's ubiquitous. But we're learning that either that ubiquity is really dangerous or the lack of water is really going to threaten that net zero transition.
So, John, what can climate planners do to fully realise water's potential in terms of climate action? It's quite a big question, really.
It's a huge question. Right now, we're in a process where countries are making 5-year climate commitments. They're called NDCs. And we're just nearing the end of the first phase. And these are completely new positions. Nobody goes to grad school to get a degree in this. And what Agwa's been doing has been creating a program. It's already been running for 3 years. It's called the Water Resilience Tracker. Essentially, it gives these national climate planners the tools to be able to talk to other ministries, to talk to exactly the people that Kate was just talking about in different sectors, and also different levels of governance. So to talk to companies, to cities, to natural resource managers, and help them see that actually water is essentially the currency that is spread between all of these areas, between levels of government, between different programs, and that we need to use that water wisely. We need to use it in a deeply resilient way. And as Kate mentioned, this 10% figure of global emissions coming from water, I mean, let's put that in perspective. What does that look like? That looks like that's more than aircraft.
It's 4 times aviation.
Exactly.
Emissions and shipping's emissions, isn't it? Something like that.
It's a huge amount. So we we really need to get a handle on this, right? It's a critical issue. We have an integrated program there called the Water Initiative for Net Zero Winds that is trying to recognize where water is in, say, utilities, dealing with all that methane, which is a kind of greenhouse supergas. And actually maybe even turn it into a resource. Actually, if we can burn methane and actually take it out of the atmosphere and make it something that's usable for utility operations, or we can take it out of a lot of our rural sanitation programs. We can actually take climate finance and invest it in ecosystems, so that to a climate scientist, a tree is just a long strand of carbon.
Yeah. But it's also, as you say, mentioning forest earlier, that a tree is also a vital sort of pumping system.
Exactly.
A natural pumping system, storing the water in the ground and pumping it out when it's needed.
That's right. We're becoming carbon gardeners now.
Yeah, exactly. And water sprinklers too. Yeah. But Kate, let me come back to you. I mean, you mentioned this point, and I think it needs answering in a sense, because we do have the new national climate plans being revised, as it were. The new ones, the NDCs coming out, revised in... They're supposed to agree by March, I think, or February, but I think that's a really unrealistic deadline. But, I mean, countries and companies working together to address this, is there really some momentum here?
Absolutely. And I think it's really exciting to see, and that's where actually our work on the Resilient Water Accelerator comes together with the Water Resilience Tracker that John mentioned. Exactly, seamlessly. Actually, so we're trying to look at those individual interventions on the ground, bottom up, as well as changing the thinking top down. Because if you're going to change the thinking, if we're going to change this paradigm, you've actually got to have real life practical examples of how things are changing and where that money can go to, and exactly looking at the opportunities that John talks about. Water's often seen as a threat, but actually huge opportunities for investment and change as well. Exactly. So we're doing a lot of work in Lagos as one example. 20 million people. Lagos is basically a lagoon and a floodplain, so huge climate resilience challenges, and yet every one of those 20 million people needs water every single day. It's a great leveler. Whether you're the CEO of a bank or you're living in an informal settlement, you need water. So we're looking at the utility level, exactly as John says. Where can we capture the biogas to generate and capture the methane, but also turn that into an energy source? Where can we actually think about the energy used to pump and treat the water and not just rely on oil and gas, but transform that into renewable energy as well? Okay. And also get rid of non-revenue water. Huge inefficiencies from water being leaked and lost to the system in the same way we talk about energy efficiency. We're also looking at wetlands. How do you protect wetlands? Again, that's saving methane, but it's also reducing flood risk.
Maybe even pull them into the system, right? Like
exactly. And so then you're thinking about how all of these things interconnect. And finally, I think there's something really exciting. This is like the water equivalent of household solar or cook stoves. Most of those people in Lagos, 90% of them, are using boreholes. And to get the water out of those boreholes, they're using petrol and diesel generators. Hugely expensive, horrific for air quality and also generating lots of emissions. Let's move that over to renewable energy, and that's where the opportunities are for investment.
Good. I'm going to have to stop you both there. I'm so sorry. We've just run out of time. In fact, we've just gone over time. A really exciting topic. Let's hope we can talk about this further in Baku in COP29. And thank you both for being on here.
Yeah.
That's great. And
Thank you.
thank you very much indeed.
Thanks, Nick.
Yes, can we now go to the very interesting solutions where water is...
Sono Alberto Bastianello, titolare dell'azienda agricola La Fagiana. Siamo a Eraclea, in provincia di Venezia, con una superficie totale di 460 ettari, di cui 160 dedicati alla coltura del riso Carnaroli.
Con Netafim abbiamo sviluppato una nuova tecnica per coltivare il nostro riso.
Abbiamo deciso nel 2018 di installare i primi 4 ettari e mezzo, quasi 5 ettari. La prima esperienza è stata interessante e ci ha portato nel corso degli anni ad arrivare a quasi 12 ettari in quest'area. Abbiamo quindi rotto il paradigma che il riso avesse esclusiva necessità della sommersione per poter essere coltivato e abbiamo iniziato a lavorare sulla coltivazione a goccia.
Questo sistema dell'ala gocciolante ci ha permesso quindi di poter garantire acqua alle nostre piante in qualsiasi punto della tenuta e soprattutto in qualsiasi condizione.
Lavorare sull'irrigazione a goccia del riso significa operare soprattutto sulla sostenibilità di questa coltivazione. Da un lato si utilizza meno acqua, circa il 60% in meno, dall'altra parte attraverso l'irrigazione possiamo fornire anche i nutrienti in fertirrigazione. Di contro una risaia di questo tipo in regime di gestione aerobica ha un bassissimo tenore di emissioni di gas serra. Comparata con le risaie convenzionali ci permette di dire che è un sistema più sostenibile.
Con questa tecnica siamo riusciti a ottenere un'ottima qualità e anche un'ottima produzione dal punto di vista di resa, ottenendo un risparmio idrico del 70%, quindi utilizzando solo il 30% rispetto alla tecnica convenzionale dell'allagamento.
Energy consumes a substantial amount of water. Our estimate is that the global energy system withdrew about 370 billion cubic meters of water in 2021. If you want to put it in terms of swimming pools, that would be about 150 million Olympic swimming pools. That's perhaps more than there are swimming pools in the world. So as energy demand goes up, it is likely that demand for fresh water will also go up. We need water for cooling, and when we produce fossil fuels, we need water to refine critical minerals that go into some of the clean energy technologies like batteries or wind generators. Some of these clean energy technologies and that have low emissions, for example, concentrated solar power, or carbon capture and storage, or nuclear power plants. All of these have actually a relatively high water footprint. Now, if we transition to a system that relies more on wind and more on solar panels, then water use by the energy sector is going to decrease. The energy sector needs to be prepared to use less water so that it is not constrained in its capacity to deliver reliable energy.
Great. Well, that was a super interesting film, and it's now time to also introduce some super interesting people as our final guests for this session. I've got with me Mike Brown, who's Global Cities Lead, Climate Bonds Initiative, and also Virginia Newton-Lewis, who's Director of Water Sustainability at Grundfos. I'm going to take the first, or fire the first question at Virginia. Okay, so how can or how should companies integrate their water stewardship and their net zero goals into one another? In other words, how do we bring water into this whole target setting?
Yeah, so the question is how can we and should we? And I'll start with the should we. Absolutely, yes, we should be integrating our climate, our water, and arguably our nature goals together. I'm of the view that we can't be resilient unless we integrate across all three of these areas, because we need to identify the synergies and the trade-offs and ensure that we're really maximizing impact for the minimum cost. Sustainability teams are facing the reality that they don't have unlimited budgets, so understanding these synergies is critically important, particularly at a time when we're seeing a large increase in the reporting requirements that sustainability teams are working with. I can give you some of the examples, if you like, of the benefits of integrating. So, for example, in the solutions space, we see that, for example, water and energy solutions often are embodied in one process. So, for example, data center cooling, if we look at liquid cooling technologies, they both save energy and save water. Or if we look at the kind of the business of sustainability itself, how global sustainability teams build business processes to really achieve impact. If you're working across synergies, you can kind of save time and resources by not replicating functions. So if it's such a good idea, why aren't we doing it, or why isn't it the norm? I would say that some of the structures and processes that we're building as we try to work very quickly in sustainability might be working against us. So, for example, having separate budget lines on water and climate, having these very separate teams working under quite a lot of pressure to meet new reporting requirements. And even in some cases, the ways that new regulations are working to kind of silo out what you're doing under pollution or climate or water. So to overcome this, really, it's about kind of pausing, taking a breath, and trying to understand that simplifying it down into water and energy might not give you the biggest impact. If we just take a moment to look at this holistically, and some of the ways that new regulation is forcing us to look at dependencies, risks, and opportunities is really helping in that regard. So yes, it's a good idea. Yes, we need it for resilience. Yes, it can seem a little trickier on first instance, but actually if we kind of take that time to analyze and pause, we can really find these holistic synergies between the two or three areas.
So, Mike, let me come to you on this subject. How can cities work with innovative financing options to fund resilient public water infrastructure?
Yeah, first I'll say, just to build on what Virginia said, I think it's important, and cities are beginning to do this, I think, is take a pause and make that link between climate and water. I think historically most cities were not making that link. So they have their water operations, their water infrastructure, and they weren't necessarily thinking about the reliability of supply, looking out 10, 20, 30 years, or what's happening with extreme precipitation, with stormwater, or even what they were doing with their sewage. If they're transporting it a long distance, that's very carbon intensive as well. So there's many, many things that can be done at the local level to reduce emissions and also build resiliency in terms of investment in water. I will say making that link between climate and water is also very valuable from a financing standpoint. Before joining Climate Bonds, I was with the city of San Francisco in the water utility there, and we issued many green bonds beginning in 2016, certified green bonds, and doing that communicated to our stakeholders, our residents and our customers, but also rating agencies and investors that we were taking into account these physical climate risks as well as mitigation and into our capital plans or projects, and that was received very well by rating agencies. They would cite our work on climate as a credit strength, and also we would attract a lot more investors. And now, and which can lead to a lower cost of borrowing, which is really the goal. And especially if you have skeptical people, you cannot argue with lower borrowing costs. I mean, that's really, it doesn't matter if you are really committed to climate or not. If you can borrow the debt at a lower cost, you have to take advantage of that.
Fair enough. Why now would it be that the world would move on this topic? I mean, one thinks about water's been on the agenda of the United Nations for as long as I worked for them, resilience building, etc. I mean, climate change has been a very long process. We're at the moment right now where I think people are understanding that we need to finance resilience more because we're facing, the 1.5 possibly shooting over. So water is going to become ever more in the center of the future of, literally billions of people. So is there a kind of now sense on water?
I'll say, I think there's a now sense on nature, and maybe that's connected to water, nature and water. And so I think, yes, and also a lot of cities recently have been experiencing drought, very severe drought.
Yeah, I mean, I think there certainly is a now sense. I've been working in water for 20 years, and I think now I see a lot more momentum and excitement about the topic. I think it's driven by, firstly, the reality of climate change impacts and water impacts that you're seeing. The floods in Europe that we've been seeing over the last week or so are very difficult to ignore. I also think that we're seeing a change in the regulatory environment, particularly for companies. So within the EU, the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive is really a game changer and is pushing companies to better understand their dependency on water, their exposure to risk, and more positively, the opportunities that can come from managing your water. I think we still have a long way to go, particularly on the kind of the framing of the water problem. Like, how do we speak about this in a way that gets traction with those who might not necessarily think of water as their first risk exposure? I think we've got a long way to go on the communication, but definitely I would say the materiality of the impacts that we see today and the regulatory environment together are kind of pushing a change in momentum.
Interesting. Good. Well, we've just run out of time. Thank you very much indeed. There's obviously a ton more to say on this topic, right? But thank you. I'm sure the audience enjoyed it. And let's see if we can get together again around COP29, either physically or over the magic of Zoom, to move forward again with some more understanding of this topic. Okay. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much.
Okay. Bye.